I am currently surviving on a single daily cup of instant noodles in a windowless room in Rio de Janeiro. And the hardest part of it all is knowing that my $1.8 million net worth wasn't stolen from me. I willingly gave it away. If you had told me a year ago that this would be my reality, I would have laughed and handed you the card of my wealth manager in Chicago. I spent 40 years as a regional director of logistics for a corporate supply chain. My entire career was built on strict compliance, mitigating risk, and eliminating margins of error. I was the man who caught the inconsistencies in the spreadsheets. I was the one who fired people for lacking foresight. I had a fully paid-off four-bedroom house in the suburbs. I had a rock-solid retirement portfolio. I was an educated, rational man who understood the global economy. People hear about an older man losing everything in a foreign country and they immediately assume he was foolish, senile maybe, a gullible target who couldn't see the obvious trap. But that's the humiliation that keeps me staring at the cracked ceiling of this dingy hostel every night, too ashamed to pick up the phone and call my daughters. I wasn't tricked by a lack of intelligence. I used my own intelligence to build the illusion. I took every glaring red flag and weaponized my own corporate logic to explain it away. I didn't lose my money because I was stupid. I lost it because my wife of 35 years passed away, my daughters grew up and moved on, and the silence in my large, empty house became completely unbearable. I was 68 years old, feeling entirely invisible to the world, and absolutely terrified of dying in a recliner without anyone ever needing me again. I orchestrated my own financial ruin because I desperately wanted to feel like I was still the architect of my destiny. I just didn't realize I was drafting the blueprints for my own collapse. Nota: o trecho original continha uma saudação de IA aqui, que foi omitida para fluidez narrativa. For 40 years, my entire existence was defined by variables, margins, and the strict mitigation of risk. I was the regional director of logistics for a mid-sized corporate firm in Chicago. Do you know what logistics really is? It's the art of predicting failure before it happens. It's looking at a shipping route, a warehouse manifest, or a vendor contract, and instantly spotting the singular flaw that could cost the company millions. I was paid very well precisely because I did not trust people. I trusted numbers. I trusted historical data. I trusted the rules. I built my personal life with that exact same ruthless efficiency. I didn't inherit a dime. I came from a working-class neighborhood where money was something you worried about, not something you invested. So, when I finally made it, I built a fortress, a four-bedroom house in the suburbs, fully paid off, a retirement portfolio diversified across low-risk index funds and municipal bonds. By the time I retired, I was sitting on $1.8 million in liquid assets and real estate. I was the guy other men in my neighborhood came to for financial advice while we stood in our driveways on Sunday mornings. I was the standard. But spreadsheets don't account for pancreatic cancer. When my wife of 35 years passed away, the fortress I had built suddenly felt completely pointless. We had raised 2 daughters in that house. Now they were grown, living in different states, busy with their own careers and their own toddlers. Which is exactly what you want for your kids, right? You want them to be independent. You want them not to need you. But the independence of your children leaves a very specific kind of silence in a 4-bedroom suburban house. After I retired, that silence became physical. It was heavy. Without the rigid structure of the office, without the emails, the quarterly reports, the people relying on me to solve their crises, I woke up every morning with absolutely nothing to fix. No one needed me. For my entire adult life, my identity was entirely tied up in being the provider, the protector, the essential figure. Without that, I wasn't a director anymore. I wasn't an architect of anything. I was just a 68-year-old man walking around an empty house in Chicago, dreading another brutal winter, waiting for the mail to arrive. I felt completely invisible. Looking back, I can see the exact moment the rot set in. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It felt like a moment of absolute clarity. I told myself I was being practical. That's the lie I sold my daughters, and it's the lie I sold myself. I sat at my dining table and drafted a spreadsheet. I compared the cost of living, health care, and property taxes in Illinois versus South America. I calculated the exchange rate. I presented my decision to sell the house and move to Rio de Janeiro, not as an escape from my crushing isolation, but as a calculated economic move. I was going to maximize my retirement yield, buy a secure, modest beachfront condo in Copacabana, live off the interest, and bypass the American tax trap. It sounded so smart, so incredibly rational. My daughters were worried, but they couldn't argue with the math. I had always been right about money. They had no reason to suspect that beneath all that bulletproof financial logic, their father wasn't making an investment strategy. He was just a desperate man, terrified of fading away, trying to buy himself one last chance to matter. I executed the relocation with the same cold precision I used to optimize freight routes. I put the 4-bedroom house on the market and closed for $600,000 in cash. I consolidated my retirement accounts, transferred the funds to a secure international brokerage, and packed 40 years of an American life into 3 checked bags. When I landed in Rio de Janeiro, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced since my wife died. I felt capable. I felt in control. Within 3 weeks, I had secured a modest, well-maintained 2-bedroom condo on Avenida Atlantica in Copacabana. I ran the numbers every morning over black coffee. The exchange rate was hovering around 5 to 1. My $1.8 million was generating enough yield that I could live in a beachfront property, eat at excellent restaurants, and pay for premium private health care without ever touching the principal. I had engineered the perfect retirement. I had outsmarted the system. For the first month, the sheer sensory overload of the city kept the silence at bay. The heat, the sound of the waves, the chaotic, beautiful rhythm of the streets, it was a temporary anesthetic. But a geographical cure only works until you unpack your bags. The problem with a perfectly executed stress-free retirement is that it leaves you with absolutely nothing to do at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. By my second month in Brazil, the novelty had evaporated, leaving behind the exact same crushing isolation I had tried to escape in Chicago. I was living in one of the most vibrant cities on earth, surrounded by millions of people, and I was entirely alone. My Portuguese was limited to ordering a taxi and asking for the check. I spent my days walking the mosaic boardwalk from Leme to Ipanema, watching families, watching couples, watching life happen to everyone else. I would sit in cafes just to hear the sound of human voices, even if I couldn't understand the words. I wasn't a director anymore. I wasn't a husband. And I was no longer an active father to my daughters. I was just an aging expat in a linen shirt, safely locked away, burning through time. That is the vulnerability people don't understand. It's not that you wake up wanting to be reckless. It's that you wake up wanting to be necessary. I didn't want to just exist comfortably. I wanted a purpose. I wanted someone to look at me and see a provider, a protector, a man who still had something of value to offer the world. I was walking around with all these accumulated resources, both financial and intellectual, and absolutely no one to give them to. I had successfully built a beautiful, sunlit cage for myself, and I was desperately waiting for a reason to open the door. 2 months into my self-imposed exile, I went to a high-end churrascaria in Ipanema. It was a Tuesday evening. I was sitting at a table for two with the second chair removed, eating a $70 steak, surrounded by laughing families and couples, feeling the absolute crushing weight of my own irrelevance. That was when the woman at the adjacent table leaned over. She had a textbook open next to her plate. She pointed to a paragraph and, in broken, hesitant English, politely asked if I could help her translate a specific medical term. Her name was Camilla. She was 28. She wasn't wearing heavy makeup or designer clothes. She had on a simple linen dress, her hair pulled back into a casual clip, and she spoke with a quiet elegance that immediately put me at ease. She told me she was a physical therapist, currently finishing her postgraduate studies. She wasn't aggressively flirtatious. She was just a serious young woman struggling with an English textbook, and I was an educated American who could help. When the waiter finally brought our separate checks, I did what any man of my generation and financial standing would do. I reached for hers. I fully expected the polite, feigned resistance you get right before they slide the bill your way. Instead, she put her hand firmly over mine. "No," she said, looking me right in the eye. "Thank you, Arthur, but I work for my money." She paid her own $30 tab with a battered debit card. Looking back from this dingy hostel room, I realized that was the exact moment the trap closed. If she had let me pay, my corporate radar would have pinged immediately. I would have categorized her as a gold digger, a known variable, a risk to be managed. But by aggressively protecting her own financial independence, she completely bypassed 40 years of defense mechanisms. I thought I was vetting her. I didn't realize she was perfectly calibrating herself to my exact psychological profile. Things moved deliberately after that. We didn't go to expensive nightclubs or luxury restaurants. She preferred daytime walks and afternoon coffees. She showed me historical, non-touristy neighborhoods, places that cost nothing. Once, we were walking through a shopping center in Leblon, and I tried to buy her a delicate gold necklace we saw in a window. She actually became upset with me. She refused to let me inside the store. "I don't want your things, Arthur," she told me, her voice tight with offended pride. "I just like your company." She started cooking for me, traditional Brazilian meals in my apartment, filling the sterile rooms with the smell of garlic and roasting meats. She introduced me to her Aunt Maria, a sweet older woman who poured me coffee in a modest apartment in Botafogo, holding my hands and telling me, translated through Camilla, that I was a literal blessing to their family. But the real anchor, the thing that locked me in completely, wasn't physical affection. It was the conversations. We were sitting on a bench near the beach one afternoon when she confessed that she had zero interest in men her own age. "They are impulsive," she told me, resting her head on my shoulder. "They are unfaithful. They have no vision. I need someone who actually understands how the world works. Gradually, she started bringing her university paperwork to my apartment. She asked for my help structuring her career path. She showed me her ideas for a future physical therapy clinic, asking me to look at the numbers. I can't even describe the intoxicating rush of those moments. I was reviewing her plans, making corrections, optimizing her margins. The silence in my life was completely gone. I was waking up with a purpose. I wasn't just a retired old man waiting to die in a foreign country anymore. I was a mentor. I was a protector. I was a man of immense, undeniable value. I was so blinded by the feeling of being necessary again that I didn't care when the little inconsistencies started to show up. Every now and then, her cell phone would ring, she'd look at the screen, and her entire posture would stiffen. She would step out onto the balcony to take the call in hushed, rapid Portuguese, coming back flustered and irritated. She would casually blame it on the notoriously terrible local carriers or claim someone had cloned her SIM card, forcing her to change her number 3 times in 2 months. I noticed it. Of course I did. I was a man trained to spot anomalies. But I didn't see a threat. I just saw the infrastructural annoyances of a developing country. I was too busy feeling like a king to worry about a glitch in the telephone network. The transition from mentor to savior happened so seamlessly, I didn't even notice the shift in gravity. It started about 4 months in. Camilla arrived at my apartment one afternoon in tears, holding a stack of official-looking documents stamped by a local notary. She didn't ask me for a dime. She just sat on my sofa, utterly defeated, and explained that the Brazilian tax authority had suddenly frozen her bank accounts due to a complex bureaucratic audit regarding her late father's estate. She couldn't pay her final university tuition installment. She was going to be dropped from her program. If someone asks you for money outright, your defenses go up. But if someone presents you with a structural problem they cannot solve, and you happen to possess the exact tool to fix it, human ego takes over. I was a man who had spent 40 years managing international supply chains. I knew all about the friction of emerging markets, corrupt institutions, inefficient banking, arbitrary legal hurdles. This made perfect logical sense to me. I didn't see a red flag. I saw a logistical bottleneck. And my entire career was built on clearing bottlenecks. I went to a local ATM and withdrew $5,000 in cash. I handed it to her, telling her it was a minor bridge loan to keep her education on track. I rationalized it instantly. Mathematically, $5,000 was a rounding error against my $1.8 million net worth. I wasn't being scammed. I was simply reallocating a fraction of my liquidity to protect an asset, her future. But the withdrawals became a pattern, a legal fee here, a penalty fine there. My daughters, who still had restricted view access to my primary U.S. checking account, noticed the cash bleeding out. The FaceTime calls started coming in more frequently, their voices tight with that specific, cautious tone children use when they think their parent is losing their mind. They asked questions I didn't want to answer, so I started avoiding them. I would time my calls only for when Camilla was out of the apartment. When the questions became too direct, I turned the blame on them. I accused them of being xenophobic, of being narrow-minded Americans who couldn't understand the complexities of a foreign economy. I told myself they were just jealous that I was finally spending my own money on my own happiness, instead of preserving it for their inheritance. Eventually, I stopped answering their calls altogether. I was completely isolating myself, severing my last tethers to reality, and I felt entirely justified in doing it. The emotional grip tightened when we officially moved in together. The sterile quiet of my life was replaced by her constant warm presence. And then came the conversation that cemented my ruin. We were lying in bed one Sunday morning, looking out at the ocean, when she rested her hand flat against my chest and told me she wanted to start a family. She wanted to give me a son. She said I had the discipline, the wisdom, and the strength to raise a real man, unlike the boys her age. When you are 68 years old, staring down the barrel of your own mortality, the promise of a new child is not just a compliment. It is an intoxicating, blinding dose of immortality. It completely rewrites your biological reality. It gave me the ultimate purpose. I wasn't just a retiree anymore. I was a patriarch in the making. Suddenly, my rented two-bedroom in Copacabana wasn't enough. A man providing for a new family needs a proper estate. Camila found the perfect property, a stunning $600,000 luxury penthouse in Barra de Tijuca, a modern, affluent neighborhood far removed from the tourist chaos. It had marble floors, panoramic windows, and a nursery room. I liquidated a third of my retirement portfolio and prepared to buy it in cash. That was when she introduced me to her lawyer. He was a polished, articulate man in a tailored suit who met us in a glass-walled conference room. He spoke excellent English. He laid out a 30-page dossier detailing the punitive tax rates the Brazilian government levied against foreign property buyers. He showed me the exact legal clauses indicating that if I put the deed in my name, I would be subjected to a 30% withholding tax, and in the event of my passing, the asset could be frozen in international probate for a decade, leaving Camila and our future child homeless. I sat in that leather chair, looking at the spreadsheets, applying my decades of corporate logic to the problem. I hated taxes. I hated bureaucratic inefficiency. The lawyer offered a frictionless workaround. Register the deed entirely in Camila's name. She was a native citizen. The tax penalties would vanish. The asset would be protected. A fool would have seen the danger, but I wasn't a fool. I was a risk manager. And in my arrogant, calculated mind, the risk of a foreign government seizing my assets seemed mathematically higher than the risk of this devoted, traditional woman betraying me. I signed the purchase agreement. I wired the $600,000. I did it with the absolute smugness of a man exploiting a corporate loophole. I felt like a genius. I had successfully bypassed the system, secured a luxury home for my new family, and proved my dominance over the variables of life. I was living in a country where I didn't speak the language, completely alienated from my own blood, sleeping in a house I paid for, but legally did not own. And I was smiling, absolutely convinced I was the one in control. The momentum of that first real estate purchase shifted something fundamental in my brain. I had crossed a line. I wasn't just a retired expat anymore. I was a major player in a foreign economy. I was building an empire for a family that didn't even exist yet. Once you convince yourself that you are the smartest person in the room, it is remarkably easy for someone to hand you the shovel and watch you dig your own grave. About a month after we moved into the Barra de Tijuca penthouse, Camila came to me with a meticulously bound 30-page dossier. It wasn't a tearful request for help this time. It was a formal business presentation. She had hired a local corporate attorney to draft a comprehensive structural and operational plan for a high-end physical therapy and wellness clinic. We sat at our massive marble dining table, and she walked me through it. I didn't just read the plan, I interrogated it. I tore into the spreadsheets, challenging her on overhead costs, patient acquisition models, and equipment depreciation, and for every aggressive corporate question I threw at her, the dossier had a cold, mathematically sound answer. The margins were aggressive, but realistic. The operational model was flawless. It appealed directly to the deepest, most ingrained part of my professional identity. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was offering me equity. She wanted to open a joint Brazilian corporate account. I would be the primary capital investor. She would be the operating director. And we would secure our wealth in Brazil, completely insulated from the American tax system and the volatility of the stock market. I looked at this beautiful, driven woman sitting across from me, presenting a bulletproof business model, and I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was my legacy. The next morning, I logged into my American brokerage accounts. I didn't hesitate. I didn't call a financial advisor. I clicked a few buttons and liquidated my entire remaining portfolio. $1.2 million. 40 years of disciplined saving, compounded interest, and careful market analysis converted into a single international wire transfer. I sent every last cent I had to a corporate account in Rio de Janeiro. I can still remember the physical sensation of hitting the confirmation key. It wasn't fear, it was euphoria. I had pushed all my chips into the center of the table. I was completely, irreversibly committed. And for a while, the universe seemed to reward my brilliance. The clinic wasn't just a concept on paper, it actually opened. We signed a lease in a premium commercial high-rise in Leblon, one of the most expensive zip codes in South America. I walked through the glass double doors and touched the state-of-the-art rehabilitation machines. I saw the sleek reception desk with our corporate logo mounted on the wall. We threw a catered grand opening party. The suite was filled with local professionals, doctors, and potential clients drinking champagne. Camilla wore a stunning dark dress, and she didn't leave my side the entire night. Whenever she introduced me to someone new, she held my arm tightly and called me her brilliant American investor and the love of her life. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights, holding a crystal glass, feeling a level of vindication that almost brought me to tears. My daughters had told me I was losing my mind. My old colleagues probably thought I was wasting away on a beach. But here I was, a kingmaker. The validation wasn't just emotional, it was tangible. For the first 3 months of operation, Camilla would come home on Friday evenings, sit on the edge of our bed, and hand me thick stacks of physical Brazilian reais. Profit dividends, she called them. The business model was working exactly as the spreadsheets had predicted. I would take the cash, put it in the safe, and smile. I had beaten the system. I had bought myself a new life, a devoted partner, and a thriving business. I was so completely surrounded by the physical proof of my success that I never stopped to wonder why, exactly, a state-of-the-art medical clinic was paying out its corporate dividends in untraceable physical cash. The illusion held for exactly 6 months. It was a random Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished my coffee on the balcony of the Barra da Tijuca penthouse. The sun was brilliant, the ocean was perfectly calm, and I was filled with that quiet, arrogant satisfaction of a man who believes he has conquered the world. I decided, entirely on a whim, to take a taxi down to Leblon and surprise Camila at the clinic. I wanted to take my wife to be out for a late lunch. When the elevator doors opened on our floor, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The glass double doors were locked, the lights were off. Our sleek corporate logo had been unceremoniously scraped off the frosted glass, leaving behind a faint, sticky residue. I stood there for a full minute, just staring at the dark, empty reception area. My brain, trained for 40 years to solve logistical errors, immediately tried to process this as a scheduling mistake, a building maintenance issue, a temporary power outage. I found the building manager down in the lobby. He barely looked up from his computer when I asked about the clinic. "They moved out over the weekend," he said in decent English. "The lease was only for 3 months. It expired." I told him he was mistaken. I told him we owned state-of-the-art medical equipment. He offered a sympathetic, almost pitying smile. "Senor, the equipment was rented. The rental company picked it up on Saturday." I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady, a residual reflex from my corporate days. I called Camila. The automated Portuguese operator told me the number was disconnected. That was the moment the floor vanished. I didn't take a taxi back to Barra da Tijuca. I took an Uber, tracking the little digital car on my screen with obsessive, desperate focus, refusing to let the panic fully materialize. I just needed to get back to the penthouse. I needed to see her. I needed the logical explanation that would put the world back on its axis. When I reached our front door, my key wouldn't turn. The locks had been changed. The building concierge, a man I had tipped generously for months, approached me in the hallway. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a legal restraining order and a formal eviction notice, both filed by the sole legal owner of the property, Camila. There was no dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, no tearful confession. The trap didn't snap shut. It simply dissolved, leaving me standing in a sterile hallway holding a piece of paper that legally barred me from the home I had paid for with my life's work. The ensuing weeks were a masterclass in modern frictionless theft. By the time I hired a local attorney, using the last few $1,000s in my personal checking account, the truth was already etched in stone. The $1.2 million I had wired for the clinic hadn't gone into a legitimate corporate holding. It had been funneled through the joint account and dispersed into untraceable offshore shell companies. The profit dividends she had handed me in cash, they were just fractions of my own money, fed back to me to keep the illusion alive. And the $600,000 penthouse was hers. I had signed the paperwork myself, completely of my own free will, advised by the lawyer she had provided. It was a masterpiece of legal, consensual ruin. My net worth went from $1.8 million to zero in the time it took the ink to dry. Which brings me here. I am currently living in a windowless room in a cheap hostel in Lapa, a neighborhood where the noise of the street bleeds through the thin walls at all hours of the night. I survive on my small monthly Social Security check. I eat instant noodles boiled in a communal microwave. I could go back to the United States. I could call my daughters, admit they were right, and ask them to wire me the money for a plane ticket. I could sleep in their guest rooms and listen to the unspoken judgment in the silence of their homes. But I can't. The shame is a physical weight that keeps me pinned to this narrow, lumpy mattress. Because the hardest truth to swallow isn't that I was robbed, it's that I was a willing accomplice. I weaponized my own intelligence, my own 40 years of corporate experience, to explain away every single glaring red flag. She didn't use a gun, and she didn't use a complex cyber hack. She used my pride. She looked at an arrogant, lonely old man who was terrified of becoming irrelevant, and she simply handed him the pen. I didn't buy a business, and I didn't buy a future. I bought the temporary illusion that I was still a man of immense value, and I paid exactly what it cost.